Chapter 10, Making Decisions. Our chapter begins with a vignette discussing McDonald's decision to add coffee bars to its restaurants. How are decisions made in business? When you complete your reading of this chapter, you should be able to compare and contrast the rational model of decision-making with Simon's normative model. Identify common decision biases, discuss knowledge management techniques used to increase knowledge sharing, and discuss the model of decision-making styles. You should also be able to summarize the positives and negatives associated with group decision-making and contrast brainstorming with other related strategies, such as the Delphi method and the nominal group technique. In this chapter, we will explore models of decision-making and the various approaches that organizations have adopted for increasing the effectiveness of managerial and organizational decisions. Decision-making is formally defined as a process of identifying and choosing solutions that lead to a desired result. The first model of decision-making that we will discuss is the so-called rational model. This model involves a four-step approach. First, the problem needs to be carefully identified. To do this, we compare the actual situation to what we desire. If there is a difference between the two, a problem exists. The second step is to generate solutions. The intensity of this step is determined by the complexity of the problem. For routine decisions, alternatives are readily available through decision rules that are embedded in the organization's policy and practices manual. The third step is to select a solution based on a list of alternatives generated in Step 2. To make an informed selection, the problem solvers maximize expected utility or increase the value of the expected outcome. The final step in the model is the implementation and evaluation stage. Here the solution alternative has been selected and implemented. The evaluation then gauges whether or not the solution is effective. In this stage, optimization is the goal. The rational model is a great starting point, but what happens when its assumptions cannot be satisfied? Simon's normative model suggests that decision-makers have limited information processing capacity. The model argues that there is a tendency to acquire manageable rather than optimal amounts of information to be considered in identifying a problem and generating solutions. Simon argues that it is difficult for managers to identify all possible alternative solutions, and that is why there is a tendency to acquire information that can be effectively managed. The use of judgmental heuristics is central to Simon's normative model for decision-making. The model suggests that managers or decision-makers use rules of thumb or shortcuts to process information. These judgmental heuristics reduce information processing demands. This model argues that individuals do not try to optimize when selecting a solution, but rather settle for satisficing or choosing a solution that meets a minimum standard of acceptance. The garbage can model assumes that decision-making is a sloppy and haphazard process. According to this model, decisions result from a complex interaction between four independent streams of events: problems, solutions, participants, and choice opportunities. The interaction of these events creates a collection of choices looking for problems, issues and feelings looking for decision situations in which they might be aired, solutions looking for issues to which they might be the answer, and decision-makers looking for work. The garbage can model has several important implications for management. First, many decisions are made by oversight or by the presence of an obvious attention-grabbing opportunity. Second, political motives often guide the process by which participants make decisions. Third, the decision-making process is sensitive to cognitive load. That is, as the amount of issues under consideration increases, any given problem is less likely to be addressed. Finally, important problems are more likely to be solved than unimportant problems because they get more attention from decision-makers. Earlier, we mentioned decision biases and heuristics. As problem solvers, we rely on a number of heuristics to ease the decision-making process, all of which may lead to poor decisions. The availability heuristic represents a decision-maker's tendency to base decisions on information that is readily available in memory. This heuristic is likely to lead people to overestimate the occurrence of unlikely events. The representativeness heuristic reflects the tendency to assess the likelihood of an event based on one's impressions about similar occurrences. The confirmation bias has two components. First, we subconsciously decide something before investigating why it is right. Then we seek information that supports our choice and discount information that does not. The anchoring bias occurs when decision makers are influenced by the first information received about a decision, even if it is irrelevant. This bias happens because initial information, impressions, data, feedback, or stereotypes anchor our subsequent judgments and decisions. The overconfidence bias relates to our tendency to be overconfident about estimates or forecasts and is particularly strong when you are asked challenging questions. The hindsight bias occurs when knowledge of an outcome influences our belief about the probability that we could have predicted the outcome earlier. The framing bias is the tendency to consider risks about gains differently than risks pertaining to losses. Finally, the escalation of commitment bias refers to the tendency to stick to an ineffective course of action when it is unlikely that the bad situation can be reversed. As you can see, there are a number of decision-making styles. This slide demonstrates the 4 decision-making styles that result from a combination of one's value orientation, whether they are task or people-oriented, and one's tolerance for ambiguity, low or high. The more task-oriented a person is, and the higher their level of tolerance for ambiguity, the more analytical that individual is in their decision-making style. At the other extreme, an individual who is highly people or social-oriented and has a low tolerance for ambiguity is said to have a behavioral decision-making style. To learn more about your own decision-making style, try out this chapter's hands-on exercise. What is your decision-making style? Is there a place for intuition in decision-making? Intuition is a capacity for attaining direct knowledge or understanding without the apparent intrusion of rational thought or logical inference. As a process, intuition is automatic and involuntary. In many decisions, it is as important as rational analysis. We discuss this further on the next slide, presenting a model of intuitive decision-making. Starting on the right, the model shows that there are 2 basic types of intuition. A holistic hunch represents a judgment based on a subconscious integration of what one already knows. People using this form of intuition may not be able to explain their preferences. By contrast, an automated experience represents a choice that is based on a familiar situation and a partially subconscious application of previously learned information related to that situation. There are also 2 sources of intuition: expertise and feelings. Expertise represents an individual's combined explicit and implicit knowledge regarding the situation in question. This source of intuition increases with experience. The feelings component reflects the automatic, underlying effect that one experiences in response to an object, person, situation, or decision opportunity. An intuitive response is based on the interaction between one's expertise and feelings in a given situation. We often hear about the need for employees, managers, and leaders to be more innovative and creative in problem-solving and decision-making. The question is whether or not organizations can foster or develop creativity among their members. In organizational behavior terms, we use the term creativity as a process of using intelligence, imagination, and skill to develop a new or novel product, object, process, or thought. Organizations can kill creative talents and innovation if they foster a short-term focus rather than a long-term view. If there is a lack of time, resources, or staff, creativity is also less likely to manifest. Incentives and rewards are also important to foster creativity and innovation. Why would we want a group to make decisions as opposed to an individual? As you can see in this slide, there are both advantages and disadvantages associated with group decision-making. It is management's task to create situations that take advantage of the pros, such as the ability to gather differing perspectives, without falling prey to the pitfalls, such as allowing a few vocal participants to dominate discussion. We now turn to a formal strategy for generating ideas in a group context. In brainstorming, the emphasis is not on evaluating ideas, but rather on generating as many ideas as possible to be used later in a selection process. Here the emphasis is on participation of group members. For brainstorming to be effective, there are rules that must be followed. As can be seen in the slide, the rules are to defer judgment about an idea, build on the ideas of others, encourage wild or creative ideas, focus on the quantity of ideas, not the quality, be visual and descriptive, stay focused, and limit the discussion to one participant at a time so that all can clearly hear the ideas. In addition to brainstorming, the nominal group technique and the Delphi technique are also used to generate ideas. In the nominal group technique, the goal is to generate ideas and evaluate solutions. But unlike brainstorming, group members do not interact with one another during the process, but instead record their ideas individually and then combine them later. The Delphi technique is a group process that anonymously generates ideas or judgments from geographically dispersed experts. Technology has enhanced problem-solving techniques as well. Computer-aided decision-making reduces consensus roadblock while collecting more information in a shorter period of time. Computer-aided decision-making processes are referred to as chauffeur-driven systems and group-driven meetings. Both are virtual team meetings where participants provide input via keyboards and may or may not see each other through digital displays. This concludes the lecture on Chapter 10. Apply the concepts that you've learned in the end-of-chapter materials, such as the ethical dilemma, should the principal of Westwood High allow an exception to the graduation dress code? And take a practice quiz on the Online Learning Center, www.mhhe.com/KINICKIOB4E.